Oh, hello. It's Muchacho. Didn't you know? Anyway, let's get down to it. This time on the Audiotent YouTube channel of Expertise and Charisma is a wonderful tutorial on reverb. Now, we need to be honest with each other for a second. You don't really understand reverb, do you? Like, you know what it is and what it sounds like, but when was the last time you created a reverb and didn't use a preset? Probably never. You use presets because you're lazy, and also because you don't really understand all the options and controls. If I'm being honest, I'm the same. I usually reach for a preset simply because I always want to keep the momentum going when I'm producing. I don't want to agonize over a few milliseconds of pre-delay when I could be making muscular bass lines. But there are times when I will make my own presets, and usually I tweak them to the track I'm working on. This is fine. I understand it's good that we've admitted this, but it's important to know what all those options do, all those ones that you ignore. So let's get down to it. First things first, I have of course made a short loop for this tutorial. Check it out. So the bassline preset that you heard there was the Audiotent preset, straight out of the Division Deluxe pack. The short melody I made is from the same pack and it's called Revolution. The pad is also from the same pack and its name is Influx. Wobbly, and all the percussion is from the Tornado pack. So one thing you'll notice is the melody I created sounds a little dry. Let's get it wet. So I'm going to use the Valhalla Room plugin to demonstrate a lot of this. The reasons being, all of the Valhalla plugins are great and incredibly well priced, and also their interfaces are very easy to understand. Big controls, everything laid out as it should be. You can use any reverb plugin as they all pretty much have the same controls. Ableton's built-in reverb is absolutely fine and I use it on nearly every track, so don't worry about rushing out and buying anything. Don't get too concerned about me having never updated my plugin since version 1. Once I get something working, I never really update it. Someone got quite upset with me for using an old version of Ozone the other day. Relax people, it's okay, the plugins work fine. So let's take a look at some of these controls. Now, most of these are common to all reverbs. They might be called something different, but the function is still the same. Over on the left hand side is the mix slider, and that's obviously the wet or dry control. And looky, another reason to use this plugin, it actually explains what all the controls do down here. So the mix control is obvious. The pre-delay is something you need to really think about, particularly when you're using a reverb on a percussive sounds, as the pre-delay will essentially set a small amount of time before the reverb is audible. Think of this much in the same way as the attack setting on a compressor. If you want to let a transient through, set a bit of pre-delay to stop it getting washed out in reverb. Listen as I tap the keys to how the pre-delay affects the sound. It's pretty obvious, really. So the next control is the decay time. This is also incredibly important to get right, as it's basically setting the length of your reverb. The longer your decay, the more epic your sound. It's hard not to get too carried away. One way to stop yourself from dialing in an absurdly long decay is to audition your settings with your track playing. Try not to listen to the sound you're working on in isolation, as a bigger reverb nearly always sounds better on its own. Next up is the high cut. Now this is where Valhalla Room might actually be a little bit odd, as it doesn't really have a low cut. Most reverbs do. Live's built-in reverb has a really good filter section, allowing you to visualize what's going on. Next up is the depth slider. This changes the balance between the early and the late reflections. Essentially, it's making the sound seem either closer or further away. So you can clearly hear how the sound seems to get further away as I increase the depth control. All the controls for both the early and the late reflections are over here on the right. It can seem a little bit daunting, but in reality they mostly just control the size and the stereo spread of the reverb. Valhalla Room does have more controls than most, and you can easily get lost in all of these settings for days. A simpler reverb is the Pro R from FabFilter. Now it does look like some sort of spaghetti explosion on the set of Tron, but don't let all the dancing glowworms put you off, it's deceptively simple. Here you'll see it does most of the hard work for you, combining a lot of options into single knobs. FabFilter, obviously being known for their EQs, include a fantastic one in their Reverb plugin here. It's one of the best around. All the usual options are here, but they've also added in a brightness control and a character knob. Take a listen. The brightness knob is really obvious, and the distance knob, as you will have heard, controls the pre-delay. It's all fairly logical, and once you understand one reverb plugin, you pretty much know how to use them all. That being said, there are different types of reverbs. As you might have guessed, Valhalla Room is modelled on physical spaces. It's meant to emulate, well, rooms, as well as concert halls, caves, kitchens, all sorts. There are things called plate reverbs, and plate reverbs are basically a sheet of metal hanging in a wooden box, similar to the mechanics of a spring reverb, which is a metal spring hanging in a wooden box. The actual operation of a spring reverb is simple. An audio signal is sent to one end of the spring by a transducer, and this creates waves that travel through the spring. At the other end of the spring, there is another transducer that converts some of the motion in the spring into an electrical signal, and hence a reverb. They both have a very distinct sound and are modelled fairly well in some plugins. Another very distinct kind of reverb is the shimmer reverb. Shimmer was pioneered by Daniel Lanois and Brian Eno. Shimmer is produced by layering a tail of reverb that's pitched up an octave and then sent through a feedback loop on top of the dry signal. With this plugin, you can also shift the reverb down as well as up, creating huge, monstrous reverb tails. Take a listen. This type of reverb is obviously not useful for every sound. It can work great on a lone guitar, for example, but usually it's more useful as an effect rather than a realistic representation of recording in a large space. When you're setting up a reverb to use in your track, there's one basic but often overlooked tip that you really should follow. It really makes a lot of sense to put your reverb plugin on a send. This is for two reasons. Number one, it'll save a lot of CPU by only using one instance of a reverb instead of adding it to multiple channels. The second reason is that it helps your recording sound like it was all made in the same space. If you use multiple reverbs, all with different decays, your track will sound disjointed, as if your lead was recorded in one room, your percussion in another, and your vocal in an underwater cave or something. It really makes a lot of sense to use one reverb for all of your elements to make your track sound more cohesive. This obviously doesn't apply to effects and things like that, like for example if you're using a reverb to create a build, but for adding ambience to your track, stick to using one reverb on a send. And one final thing that I probably should address, and I actually get this question quite a lot. It is okay to use a reverb on your bass line, as long as you EQ off the low end of your reverb, as I have done here. What happens is you just create a big space for your bass line to sit in. You don't want to overdo it, but as you'll see here, it does not interfere with the very, very low end. So you'll see it rolls off nicely at about 100 Hertz there, thus not interfering with your very sub frequencies. You have to bear in mind, adding a reverb to your bass line does make it sound bigger, but it does seem to lose some of its punch as the transients can kind of get washed out within itself, if that makes sense. If you want something punchy, I'd make it more dry. However, don't get too scared of adding a reverb to a bass line. As long as you tame it, don't go overboard, and you filter off all the low end, you should be fine. Okay, I hope you found that useful. Let me know down in the comments what your favorite reverb plugin is, and I'll be sure to check it out.